Alright, today I'm going to show you how I built a computer for $400. And you can too, with a little bit of shopping. Let's start off with RAM. Right here I have two 4GB sticks of DDR4 RAM. I already had this, but you can get similar modules for around $40 online. Next up, the motherboard. The motherboard I got was an ASRock B450M Pro 4. I was able to pull this from eBay for $45.05. We're going to install our RAM modules. If you have two RAM modules, make sure to put them in the right slots so you end up with dual channel. I got a decent deal on this CPU here. It's a Ryzen 5 2600 that I got for $47.70. But you'll probably notice an issue. I got bent pins and broken pins, so I'm going to repair it by adding a little bit of solder and then soldering the lead of a resistor onto the CPU. I was able to cut off the excess and I was left with a perfectly sized CPU pin. Next was just bending back all the CPU pins into their correct spot, and I was left with not the cleanest looking but functional Ryzen 5 2600. I'm going to install that into the socket. Now, since all the pins are a little bit bent back and forth, I had to give it a little bit of a wiggle to get it to fit correctly into the socket. Now, when I bought the CPU, it didn't come with a cooler, so I picked a cooler from what I had. Here's an example of two coolers I bought from a thrift shop for around $6 each. These are a good option, but unfortunately I only had the mounting brackets for Intel. So I'm going with a similar CPU cooler, the CryoRig H7, which I custom 3D printed a mount for and was able to install it onto our motherboard. Now, a similar mount could be DIY'd with wood, plastic, or probably even cardboard if you wanted to be super adventurous. Now I just have to install the mounting hardware for the CPU cooler. In this case, 4 screws go in through the back, and then rubber nubs go on top of each screw, and then the CPU cooler is placed on top. Don't mind the thermal paste, it was a little goopy today. Next, just tighten all the screws to the CPU cooler, and you're good to go. After that, I installed a fan that I had laying around. I believe this is actually the fan from the Hyper 212 I showed earlier. Here's the power supply I'm using. This is one I had lying around, but I've seen similar power supplies at thrift stores for around $10. But if you want to buy one online, looks like you can get one for $35. Here's the case I bought. I bought this case from Newegg for a total of $41.32. This case has a tempered glass side panel, 4 pre-installed fans, and filtered intakes. The case comes with a bag of goodies, which you'll need to install the parts. I take off the back panel so I can start installing some components. First I installed the motherboard. Unfortunately, the motherboard I bought didn't come with an IO shield, so we're just going to have to live with that. Screw it in, and next we'll move on to the power supply. I put the fan up just to be an epic gamer, and screwed the power supply in. And look at all these cables. What am I going to do with those? Unscrewed the SSD mounting bracket, and installed an SSD I had lying around. Similar SSDs can be bought online for around $30. Now it's time to put that SSD back in. Now to plug in the SATA and power connectors. Here's the graphics card I'm going to be installing. It's a GTX 960 4GB edition. Graphics cards are going to be the hardest part to get a hold of, but you should be able to pick something up for around $150 with similar performance. Now just install the graphics card and plug in the PCIe power. Boom, there we go. Now we have a system we just built, and you can see it powers on right here. Alright, so I just got into the BIOS and I've already installed Windows, but just to show you, I have everything on auto settings. So we got the stock RAM speed and the stock CPU speed. We're going to boot into Windows and I'm going to show you the performance. Okay, so now I'm into Windows here, and you can see if in Task Manager, looking at the base frequency, 3.4 gigahertz, and we're at 2133 on the RAM. Let's just do a quick CPU benchmark. For this, I'm going to use Cinebench. This is a fairly quick test to see kind of your single thread and multi-thread performance of a CPU. Alright, so let's run this right here, and we're going to watch the clock rate on our CPU. So stock, this CPU will boost up to around 3.9 gigahertz As you can see, we're at around 3.71 right now. Now it's still fairly quick, but if we want to get the most from our CPU, we're going to want to overclock. Okay, so the test just finished, and you can see down here our CPU got 7,092 points. So that's pretty good, but we're going to see what we can do once we overclock. The next thing I'm going to do is download this benchmark here. It's called Unigine Heaven. It is a classic benchmark they've been using for years to test the stability of systems and how fast they actually run. So we're going to download it here. Now for this test, I'm just going to run it on pretty much the max settings. And remember, we are running at 1080p resolution. So you can see in the top right corner, it's going to tell us our FPS. It's going to be telling us how fast our graphics card's running at, as well as the temperature of our graphics card. So this is going to be helpful when we start overclocking our GPU. And the benchmark feature is going to let us get a measurable number for how fast our computer is actually running. This is going to be helpful to see our combined performance of CPU and GPU power. And we'll be able to test how much of a difference you get from just overclocking your CPU or just overclocking your GPU, as well as combining both overclocks. Alright, so the benchmark finished here. You can see we had an average FPS of 32.4, a score of 816, and you can see our minimum and maximum FPS. So we're going to want to keep this in mind once we start overclocking. Okay, so now that I'm in the BIOS, I'm going to do some simple overclocking features here. So the first thing I saw was this spread spectrum thing. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it does say disable it to achieve higher clock speeds when overclocking. So sounds like a plus to me. I'm going to disable that. Next, I'm going to go into a manual CPU frequency and voltage. And for our frequency, we're going to start off with a 3.9 gigahertz overclock. So this means that all cores are always going to be at 3.9 gigahertz. And that's just going to give us a little bit of boost because it's kind of forcing our CPU to always be boosting to its max. For the voltage, you're going to want to adjust this. Obviously, you don't want to put it too high. I think a good starting point is probably 1.25 volts. That's a very good safe voltage, and your CPU cooler should be able to handle that. Now, I'm not going to say I'm an expert in overclocking, but I do know the basics. So next thing I'm going to do is for our SoC voltage, you don't necessarily have to adjust this. But I'm going to put this at 1.15 volts here. This is going to improve our RAM stability, and it also controls some other functions on the CPU. So now we're going to want to go down to our RAM, and depending on the speed of your RAM, you're going to want to kind of follow that. So in this case, I have DDR4 3000 megahertz. The Infinity Fabric on Ryzen is directly related to the memory speed. So having more memory speed is generally better, but you also want to keep your timings in check. The problem with second gen Ryzen is that the memory controllers built into the CPU are not super robust, and so you can't run super high RAM frequencies. Even though your RAM will support that frequency, the CPU may not. So just for the moment, we're going to try a slight overclock to 2800 megahertz. What I mean by slight overclock is it's going over that base frequency of 2133. Even though our RAM supports 3000 megahertz, I'm going to put it to 2800 for now. And for the DRAM timing, you're going to want to Google what the timing should be for your computer. Now in this case, it automatically set it to 16, 20, 20, 40. These are pretty loose timings other than that CAS latency. For now, I'm going to keep that. Just wanted to double check that that's where it was at. I didn't want it to run at a CAS latency of 15 or whatnot. Now for me, I've tried running at CAS latency 15, but I seem to have more stability issues. Seems like running at even numbers of CAS latency at least works better, but your mileage may vary. I don't know. The last thing I'm going to do is set the DRAM voltage. So you're going to want to check with your RAM and see what voltage it's rated for. In this case, it's rated for 1.35 volts, so I'm going to put that in. Alright, so now that our overclock settings have been put in, just want to go all the way back to the right, save the settings and exit. Alright, so now we're back into Windows. I'm going to open Task Manager here, and if we go to the Performance tab, we're going to see that now we're running at a 3.9 gigahertz all the time. Now, generally overclocking is not dangerous, but you do want to be careful with what you're doing, and before you change any settings, you should understand what you're changing. So this isn't really a tutorial, but I recommend you look online and figure out what the general parameters mean and what they do before you start actually putting in the numbers. Alright, so Cinebench just finished for the second time, and you can see we have a lot higher score here. Now we're at 7594, which is quite a few points above what we were running before, which I believe was just over 7,000. So you can see we're already making up a lot of speed here, and basically you're getting free performance from your CPU at the cost of maybe a little bit more power from the wall. What you want to do from here is just continue restarting your computer, going into the BIOS, increasing the megahertz just slightly, increasing maybe your RAM megahertz just slightly, and do that until once you run Cinebench, your computer crashes or is unstable, and then you want to step it down maybe a couple steps. That way you know that your system will be stable and you can run it for 24/7 if you wanted to. Alright, so in this case, I'm going to go for gold and step it up to maybe 4 gigahertz. The thing about overclocking is that not every chip is going to be able to overclock the same amount. You might get lucky and a chip will be able to go higher, and some chips you will not be so good. I'm going to try my luck. I'm going to go for 4 gigahertz right here. I'm going to keep the RAM the same, just so I can give myself a little bit more overclocking headroom. I'm going to step the voltage up to 1.3 volts. Now for my CPU cooling solution, I think 1.3 volts is acceptable and should be safe to run for the long run. Alright, so our third test just finished. Now we're hitting 7794 here, so we're getting close to 8,000 here. And you can see what's impressive here is that right here there's a 12 core, 24 thread Intel Xeon. Sure, it's a little old probably, and you know, it's only running at 2.7 gigahertz there, but you can see we have half the cores, but we're actually going to meet the same score here. Alright, so now at this point, I'd say most people would probably want to stop at 4 gigahertz, maybe call it good. But if you're feeling adventurous, just keep stepping it up. I mean, obviously you want to do some more steps than I'm doing here, but I'm going to step it up to 4.1. And I'm going to run 1.325 volts. I'm going to probably stop there. Any higher, and then you're going to start degrading your CPU, most likely. Over time, of course. It really depends on how long you want to have a CPU. I mean, is it okay that after 10 years of running the CPU, it won't be able to boot anymore? I'd say that's fine, you know, a little bit of degradation is fine. Alright, so after messing with the overclocks for a little bit, I ended up just sticking back with the 4 gigahertz overclock with the RAM at 2800 megahertz. Definitely not anything super fast. And you can see we're running around 7800 points on Cinebench. I could go a little faster, but then the system seemed to have instability issues. And so I didn't want to kind of risk anything, especially when we start overclocking the GPU. I want to know that our CPU overclock is rock solid. So 4 gigahertz at 1.3 volts with a memory at CL16 and speed at 2800 megahertz. Now we're going to get into the GPU overclocks. You're going to want to install a program called Msi Afterburner. This program will just allow you to adjust the power limits and the boost frequencies of your graphics card. So let's open up the Heaven benchmark here, and we're going to tell it to run. The Heaven benchmark is going to stress our system, and so then we're going to be able to notice any problems, any crashing, and any flickering, as well as any artifacts while we're overclocking. I'm going to pull up Msi Afterburner here. And so right now we are at stock settings. I think the first thing you're going to want to do is just slide your power limit all the way to the max. This is going to theoretically give your graphics card a little bit more power to work with while it's boosting. And so now we're going to start adjusting our core clock and memory clock. I'm going to start out with maybe a 50 megahertz core clock boost and maybe a 200 megahertz memory boost. We're going to press the accept button down here, and if we open back up Heaven, you can see that we are running the benchmark still. So the stress test is running, and you're going to want to let it run for maybe however long you want, maybe a minute. Just look for any artifacts and make sure it doesn't crash. You can see we're running pretty stable here. So I'm going to go back to our Heaven, maybe bump that up to 60, maybe the memory to 250. And I'm just going to keep working my way up until I notice any instability or our system crashes or something like that. And then we're going to want to step it a couple steps down maybe. That way you know a reliable system. Now when you're overclocking, If you overclock a little bit too far, you might still be stable, but your performance might actually be lower. And this is because of something called error correction. If your computer starts having instability problems, it's going to try and fix those problems but in the background, and it's actually going to slow down your system, but you're not actually going to crash. So we're going to be able to test that when we do the benchmark on Unigine Heaven. We're going to actually see if our performance is better after we overclocked or not. Alright, so I've gotten to a point where I've overclocked my RAM so much that I'm starting to see these artifacts. See if I can pick them up on camera here, but textures will kind of just disappear for a second. There'll be little black flashes. And so once you get to that point, you know you're at the limit. You need to turn it down because you're already becoming unstable. Alright, so here we actually crashed the program. So we know it is not stable. So I had to open up Task Manager and actually kill the program here. So at this point, I'm going to step our thing down to 120. And you know what? I'm actually going to go back down to 500 here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that. I'm going to save this program into one of our slots here, which then that will let us to kind of have a default program. Alright, so now at this point, we're going to restart Heaven. And then we're going to run a benchmark and see if we actually got more performance from doing our overclocks. We're going to see if we actually improved the system, or maybe we hurt it. Alright, so the benchmark finished, and you can see we have an average FPS of 36.2, a score of 911, and minimum FPS at 18.4, max at 78.8. So if you're comparing to our results before, we had an average FPS of 32.4 and a score of 816. So almost 100 points more on the score. And you can see one of the most dramatic things that improved was our minimum FPS there. We went from 7.4 all the way to 18.4 FPS on our minimums. That's one of the things you're going to notice the most in games is the minimum FPS, because that's going to be when you're going to get those frame drops, and you're going to want to keep that as high as possible. So you can see spending an afternoon, give it your PC a little bit of an overclock is going to improve its performance for free at the cost of a little bit of power. Now you know you've got the best of what your system can handle. I've just loaded up Warzone here, and we're going to see what the performance looks like. Now obviously the GTX 960 is a little bit old, and so it's going to be kind of pushed to its limit in this title, but basically I'm running at full 1080p, and the settings are all pretty much at the lowest, except for we got bullet impacts, tessellations on near. I turned on just a teeny bit of anti-aliasing. So we're going to try that out. We're going to just get straight into a match here. With the Ryzen 5 2600, we have a lot of CPU headroom. Because it is a 6-core CPU, it's going to be plenty for pretty much all titles here in 2021. Now the GTX 960 is definitely aged, and it's not going to be powerful enough to keep up with the CPU, so that is what you would call a GPU bottleneck. So obviously if you're able to snag a better GPU, something maybe like an RX 580, RX 570, maybe even like a GTX 980 Ti, that would be pretty sweet, and I think it would match this CPU a lot better. Now even on low graphics, I think this game looks okay. Obviously the wall textures, sometimes it takes a while for some of the wall textures to load in. I'm not 100% sure why that is. But you can see here we're running around 50 FPS on 1080p low settings. Not too bad. I'd say that's definitely playable. Now obviously if you want more FPS, you could either turn down the render resolution a little bit. You could get a little bit better FPS. Or you could try turning it up to medium settings, which we might try here in a second. Basically just slam the render resolution to the bottom. We're going to look at what FPS we're getting now. So the game definitely looks a lot worse, but we are in the 70 FPS range now. And I think one of the most important things is that our 99% FPS is still really high. You're not going to notice any dips because you're not going to notice any frame drops as long as our 99 FPS is above that 30, 40 FPS mark, which is really good to see. So now I'm going to try medium settings, 1080p, and we're just going to see if maybe we can stay above 30 FPS. So in this case, since we only have 4 gigs of VRAM, we're going to be running into a bit of a situation here if you try to go too high on these textures. So I guess we're going to stick to maybe low and then normal. You know, we're just going to try a mix of settings here and see how that looks. So we got kind of a mix of settings. I'm still playing at low. We're mostly stuck here on the texture resolution, and streaming quality seems to be really eating up our VRAM. Otherwise, I could turn things up a little bit. So let's apply those settings and see how we're running here. Alright, so now we're running the game 1080p, medium-ish settings, still low settings on the graphics quality because of our VRAM limit, but we are still in that 40-45 FPS range, sometimes hitting 50. And you can look at our 99% here, and we're just barely staying around that 30 range. Looks like we dip down into the 20s every once in a while, but you know, it's definitely playable. So it just shows on this kind of older graphics card, you can still get a lot of value out of it. And you can build a system for $400 in this market that, you know, you're still able to enjoy games. I'm not saying it's the best value, and of course, if you're able to buy an Xbox, a new Xbox or whatnot for MSRP, and of course if you're to buy any of these graphics cards for MSRP, you're going to get a better value. I'm just showing you, if you were to go on the Mercari and eBay and buy parts right now, and just, you could build a system with this level of performance. And the best thing about building a computer is this is totally upgradable. If I wait a year and then I get, say, I could pop in a 3060 in this thing, and it's gonna crush every game that I put at it. And of course, upgrade the RAM. I know for a fact that we're probably pinning the system with 8 gigs of RAM right now, because 8 gigs is just, for Call of Duty in 2021, it's not enough. It's really at the limit. You really, if you can stretch your budget, I would get 16 gigs of RAM, because it's going to improve the entire experience quite a bit. And if you end up doing any sort of video editing or something like that, then that extra RAM is really going to help. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to pop over to Fortnite. I'm going to show you, you can get some serious performance in Fortnite because of DirectX 12 and their performance mode. Alright, so I made it into Fortnite here, and I'm going to show you what kind of settings we're running here. So if we go into our settings here, 1080p, unlimited frame rate, and you can see we are running at full 1080p graphics. We are running at full 1080p render resolution. I put the view distance to epic, and then everything else I put to medium with VSync and motion blur turned off. And that's pretty much it. We're going to see how that runs. You can see in the menu here we're cranking out over 200 FPS. Let's pop into a quick solo match here and see how it runs. Now what I like about Fortnite is it actually, in my opinion, the game runs pretty good. Now it's not going to run as good as some of your other esports titles, like maybe CSGO, or you're running League of Legends or Dota 2, you know, things like that. Those games are older, and so the graphics are not as intense, and they were built around older, computer internals. So as you can see here, if we're running at Fortnite's a more modern game. Of course, it's a few years old, but they keep updating it. And so I like it because it's pretty optimized for what it is. Medium settings, I think the game looks still pretty good, and you still have some shadows. When you turn the shadows up really high, honestly, it makes things harder to see in the game. So honestly, medium works out really well. And yeah, running anywhere from 80 to 100 FPS with our 99% hovering around that 60. So it definitely runs really good on medium settings. Alright, so there's quite a big difference at high settings. Things will look a lot better, but you will notice our FPS has almost halved. We were running 80, 90, 100 FPS now. Maybe it hasn't halved, but it's now we're looking around 60. So still looks quite good though. Still looks pretty good. And you'll notice one thing when you go up to the high settings is now the edges of things aren't going to be looking so jaggedy. You're not going to notice things like that. Alright, so just for fun, I just cranked the settings to epic, and I'm getting some weird screen tearing on my screen. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see the performance is still decent enough. I mean, we're running around 30 FPS. The 99% is starting to dip down into that unplayable range, but for what it is, it's not too bad. So like on this older hardware, games like Fortnite are gonna run really well. Now, one thing about Fortnite is if you're even running say you have a high refresh rate monitor like 144 FPS or 240 FPS that you got on sale for, say, you can turn Fortnite into performance mode. It's a beta performance mode, and basically what it does, it cuts all the shadows out of the game. The graphics go down in quality, but you get insane FPS. I'm talking over 200 while you're playing, and that's what I used to do quite a bit, just for that extra FPS advantage, because I had a high refresh monitor. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I mean, I guess you got to see me do a lot of things today. I mean, I repaired a CPU and built a system and showed you kind of what you can expect in a couple games. Obviously, any other games, you're going to be able to look up the results. I'm talking CSGO, any of these slightly older, less demanding titles, you're obviously going to be able to play them no problem. Things like Call of Duty are probably going to be the most demanding games you can play on a system like this, because they're the demanding graphics requirement. So hopefully maybe you learned something today or you found it interesting, but thanks for watching, and I plan on making some more videos. Hopefully next time we're going to be trying to build a little bit of an interesting PC build and building our own PC case, but we'll see.